So coming to the thyroid gland again, thyroid gland is situated in the neck region. In the neck region, we have trachea. The trachea has its tracheal walls which do not collapse. It is remain open throughout the entire life because it is supported by cartilaginous rings. We call them as tracheal rings. So there are first, second, third, fourth, etc. Tracheal rings are present. And the thyroid gland is represented by a pair of lobes. And these are connected by a middle lobe called as isthmus. Actually, literally, isthmus means bridge. So this acts as a bridge in connecting these two lobes. Thus, thyroid gland is situated at the root of the throat, represented by two lateral lobes on either side of trachea, joined by thyroid tissue called as isthmus, which is also called as middle lobe, that is present in front of second, third, and fourth tracheal rings. And coming to its weight and blood supply, its normal weight is 20 to 25 grams, but the weight is influenced by age, sex, that means it varies in male and female also, and the maturity, sexual maturity, and even with the diet. And it is supplied, thyroid gland is supplied by thyroid arteries. There are two arteries. One is superior thyroid artery and the other is inferior thyroid artery. So thyroid is supplied by superior and inferior arteries, and the blood out of the thyroid comes out, which we call it as venous drainage. It goes into the internal jugular vein. The vein that is present in the neck region is called as the internal jugular vein and innominate veins. So this is how it comes and it gets drained from the thyroid gland. The most important thing is that, for example, uh, there is a particular organ, let us say liver. Liver is said to be around 500 grams in weight. Let's say it requires 500 ml of blood. That means for every 1 gram, 1 ml of blood is said to be required. If we take thyroid gland, it is very small, only 25 grams, but it requires a blood which is 20 times more than that of its weight. It requires blood 20 times more than that of its weight. That means it requires around 400 ml of blood. Why? Because it has to synthesize certain hormones, which we call them as thyroid hormones, that are involved in almost nothing in the body is can escape thyroid hormones. Why? Because it is responsible for the general growth of the body, which we call it as somatic growth. It is responsible for our sexual growth. It is responsible for our mental growth. It is responsible for our musculature. Literally, all parts of the body are under the control of this hormone. So it needs to be producing, this thyroid gland needs to produce this hormone in large quantities. At the same time, this hormone depends on iodine. So iodine that is present in the blood, though in small quantities, unless otherwise large amounts of blood are transported to thyroid, large amounts of iodine cannot be trapped. That is the reason why more amount of blood is drained into the thyroid gland when compared with the other normal parts of the body. Okay. There is a scientist called as Emil Theodor Kocher. He got the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for his work on the physiology, pathology, and surgery of the thyroid gland in 1909. So the entire physiology and pathology was known to the world by the research work done by Mr. Theodore. And coming to the blood flow, as I've just told you, it is supplied blood 20 times it's what is needed as per its weight. The blood supply to thyroid gland varies from 3.5 to 6 ml per gram of thyroid per minute. The main purpose of this high flow of blood is the high flow rate serves to supply the tissue with sufficient inorganic iodide. That is the main reason why this much blood flow is required for the thyroid gland. Coming to the histology of the thyroid gland. Thyroid gland is found to be made up of, excuse me, someone has gone. So thyroid gland is said to be made up of a number of follicles, structures called as follicles. Is the slide visible to you? Okay. So when we see thyroid gland, it shows a number of groups of cells. We can call them as follicles. These are thyroid follicles. Interspersed among the follicles are specialized groups of cells. Among the follicles, there are specialized groups of cells. And these cells around each follicle are called as follicular epithelium, and the cells as follicular epithelial cells. And the cells which are interspersed among the follicles are called as parafollicular cells. These are also called simply as C cells. Parafollicular cells are also called as C cells. And the most fascinating effect of this particular thyroid gland is that it stores the hormone at the center of the follicles. It stores the hormone at the center of the follicles. This hormone is called as this stored product is called as colloid. Thus, every follicle has stored form of hormone in the form of colloid. And this colloid contains hormones which are of two types, T3 and T4, the synthesis of which we are going to learn in the coming slides. And coming to the C cells, these are called as parafollicular cells because they are present by the side of follicles, and also as C cells. Here, C refers to their action with respect to calcium regulation, and this is called as calcitonin, where calcium refers to calcium. So this hormone, these C cells secrete a hormone called as calcitonin. Hence, these are called as C for calcitonin, calcitonin cells. Because this hormone is secreted by thyroid gland, we can call this as thyrocalcitonin. Thus, we have three different types of hormones synthesized and secreted by thyroid gland. One is called as T3 hormone, the other is called as T4 hormone, the third one is called as thyrocalcitonin. So coming to the histology, thyroid consists of a number of follicles. The height of this epithelium of each follicle depends on the hypo or hyperthyroid state. In hyperthyroid state, The follicle is this much. Okay, the size of the follicle is said to be very large, very long in a hyperthyroid state. Whereas in case of a hypothyroid state, it is said to be somewhat smaller in size. Thus, the height of the epithelial cells depend upon the state of the thyroid gland. And these cells are arranged in spherical structure called as thyroid follicles. And these thyroid follicular epithelial cells, on their surface, they have thyrotropin receptors. Each cell shows a thyrotropin receptor. Receptor, we know it is nothing but an extrinsic protein. Okay, to which the thyroid stimulating hormone released by anterior pituitary attaches so that thyroid gland is stimulated and it starts synthesizing and secreting the thyroid hormone. However, this anterior pituitary, we have already seen that it is under the control of thyroid stimulating hormone releasing hormone that is secreted by the hypothalamus. So, thus, thyroid follicles are under the direct control of thyroid stimulating hormone released by anterior pituitary and indirect control of thyroid stimulating hormone releasing hormone secreted by the hypothalamus. In addition to this, there are certain cells which are present among the follicles. We call them as parafollicular cells or C cells which secrete thyrocalcitonin. Coming to the structure of the follicles, they can be either spherical in shape or oval in shape, or the size may vary. It can be irregular. And these follicular epithelial cells, because it is a cell, it can produce proteins. The main important protein that is produced is a large, or we can call it as high molecular weight protein. HMW means high molecular weight protein. This high molecular weight protein is called as thyroglobulin. So each cell produces what we call it as thyroglobulin. Within the cell, a number of cytoplasmic vesicles are found, and many of these at least are absorption vesicles and are responsible for absorption of colloid followed by the release of the thyroid hormones, which process is called as pinocytosis, which I am going to explain in shortly. I'm coming to the thyroid hormones. Leaving about the thyrocalcitonin, the main two hormones that are secreted by thyroid gland are called as T4, also called as thyroxine, and T3, also called as triiodothyronine. Both are iodine-based hormones. That means without iodine, these hormones cannot be synthesized. So what actually happens is, this is the thyroid follicular epithelial cell. Okay, it synthesizes thyroglobulin and releases into the colloid after the synthesis of what we call the hormones takes place. And these hormones are generally called as iodothyronins. Both T3 and T4 are called as iodothyronins. The name shows that they require two components, iodine and tyrosine. First one is iodine, the other is tyrosine. Thyroglobulin is a large protein with a number of amino acids. Of these, nearly 100 to 120 amino acids are only tyrosines. The remaining are different amino acids. And the iodine gets attached to these tyrosines. Hence, these hormones are called as iodothyronins. When only one iodine is attached to tyrosine, we call this as monoiodo. కనిపించట్లేదా మళ్ళీ పోయిందా కనిపిస్తుంది కదా తల్లి నాకు కూడాను ఒకసారి నెట్ స్లోగా ఉందేమో ఇది మిగిలిన వాళ్ళకి కనబడుతుందండి అందరికి ఓకే ఓకే ఒకసారి నెట్ స్లోగా ఉన్నట్టు చూడండి సో హియర్ టు ఈచ్ టైరోసిన్ one iodine is said to be added. When one iodine is added, we call it as monoiodothyronine. When two iodines are added, we call it as diiodothyronine. So throughout the length of the thyroglobulin, we come across with iodothyronins, which are either mono or diiodothyronins. Now what happens is, after the formation of mono and diiodothyronins, there occur two processes. One is called as coupling, the other is called as condensation. Okay, this is monoiodothyronin and this is diiodothyronin. So one monoiodothyronin adjacent to which there is a diiodothyronin, both of them undergo coupling, they undergo coupling to produce a triiodothyronin, where there are 1, 2, 3 iodine molecules. So these two combine or undergo coupling, a process called as coupling, to form a triiodothyronin, which we call it as T3 hormone, because there are 3 iodine molecules. In the same thyroglobulin molecule, there are two diiodothyronins together. This is also diiodothyronin, this is also diiodothyronin. Both the diiodothyronins, which are present side by side, undergo condensation to form tetraiodothyronin. In short, we call it as T4, and that is called as thyroxine also. Thus, we have 4 different types of iodothyronins being synthesized. One is called as monoiodothyronin, second one diiodothyronin, third one triiodothyronin, fourth one tetraiodothyronin. Why? It has only one iodine, it has 2, it has 3, and it has 4. Of these 4 molecules or hormones, only triiodothyronin and tetraiodothyronins are active hormones. These are only active hormones. So when thyroid gland is stimulated by thyroid stimulating hormone, only T3 and T4 are secreted, and mono and diiodothyronins remain in the thyroglobulin itself, and they are said to be recycled. The iodine here is recycled for further process of iodination. Okay, so thus, though there are 4 types of iodothyronins, only 2 are potential hormones. So let us see how these are synthesized. T4 and T3 are produced from thyroid follicular cells under the influence of thyroid stimulating hormone. And thyroglobulin is called as the precursor of these hormones because it is without thyroglobulin, without the tyrosine residues, iodine cannot be added. So thyroglobulin is must and should for the synthesis of thyroid hormones. So thus this thyroglobulin, which is a large protein, because it contains more number of tyrosine residues, it is also called as tyrosinated protein. It is called as tyrosinated protein because it contains more number of tyrosine residues, and this acts as the precursor. Until thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates it, it shows mono, di, tri, and tetraiodothyronins as integral components of the thyroglobulin. They are not separated. All are part and parcel of the same molecule. Only when it is stimulated by thyroid stimulating hormone, then T3 and T4 are released, whereas mono and diiodothyronins are involved in recycling the iodine and other residues for the further synthesis of the same hormones. Okay, coming to the synthesis of thyroglobulin first, which is the precursor. It is an iodinated glycopeptide of molecular weight of 6,08,000, 80,000. Thus, it is a very large molecule, high molecular weight protein. The polypeptide part of this glycoprotein is synthesized on RER of the follicular epithelial cell. After that, from RER, vesicles arise. They go into Golgi, where the carbohydrate moiety is said to be added. Thus, a fully functional thyroglobulin, which acts as the precursor with a number of tyrosine residues, is said to be synthesized. Okay. Coming to the synthesis of hormones, sequentially, the first step is trapping of iodide. So when we see a thyroid gland, so this is the thyroid follicular epithelial cell to which blood is supplied. In the blood, when we take food, the food contains iodine. Previously, when I was studying, I studied that thyroid gland secretes only thyroxine. We don't know anything about mono, di, and tridothyronine. Even when blood is said to be tested, we see only thyroxine. But after 10 to 20 years, we came to know about the presence of that second hormone. And how we came to know? Because the sensitivity of the instruments or uh, protocols, we can call them as, is said to be increased so that they could identify a second hormone in the blood, that is T3. And what is the difference between these two? Why T4 is said to be found first? Why not T3? T3 compared with T4 is more potent. It is its potential or its functional capacity is more when compared with thyroxine. Secondly, when compared with T4, it lives short duration. For example, if T4 lives for 8 days, its half-life is 8 days, T3 is only 2 days. So, most part of the time, we can see only T4 when we take blood. If at all we see T3 after 2 days, very much traces only can be traces of T3 can be seen, and the instrument should be very sensitive enough to recognize these traces. That is the reason why this is not first recognized. Later it was recognized. For both these hormones to be synthesized, we need iodine. Okay. At the same time, when I was studying, again coming back to that same point, when I was studying, there is an ad going on in the then black and white TVs. So what is that ad? The ad says that the salt, the table salt that we use in cooking, they used to say it is iodinated or it is rich in iodine. Why? Because there are certain areas, we can call them as belts, where there is iodine deficiency in the water that they drink. Generally, we take iodine from water only. When the water is deficient of iodine, those people are not able to produce thyroxine and they end up with a disease called as goiter. And doctors, scientists plunged onto this aspect and they came to know that iodine is required for thyroxine synthesis. So, what is the simplest way that everyone in India can take iodine? We cannot force everyone to take iodine. We cannot we cannot ask them to take iodine pills, iodine tablets, etc. The simplest way is that every human being on earth cannot eat anything without salt because it does not add flavor if salt is not there. Salt adds flavor, so everyone uses salt, and the government decided that every table salt packet should contain minimum quantities of iodine as prescribed by the medical standards. So thus we take food, either water, food, or through the table salt, we get iodine. Once it goes into the iodine, so once it goes into the blood, it is ionized to form iodide molecules. Okay, iodine is ionized to form iodide molecules. So the iodide ions, sorry. These iodide ions are transported through the blood to different parts of the body and they also reach the thyroid follicular epithelial cells. So here we come across with a number of capillaries supplied here, and through these capillaries, through the follicular epithelial cell, the iodide has to enter. And this is accomplished by the presence of an iodine pump. So there is an iodine pump like sodium potassium pump, sodium channel, chloride channel. Likewise, there is an iodide channel. So this iodine pump transports only iodide. So iodide goes inside. Once it goes inside, it gets again oxidized to produce iodine molecule so that it cannot come out of the cell. Why? Iodine channels can transport only the ionic form but not the molecular form. So once it is converted to molecular form, we can say that this iodine is trapped inside the follicular epithelial cell. So that is the first process. First thing is synthesis of thyroglobulin followed by trapping of iodide. So thyroid gland accumulates inorganic iodide. This is an active process, active transport mechanism which requires energy. And the ratio of thyroid iodide to plasma iodide is about 20 is to 1 to 100 is to 1. So 5 times it is said to be concentrated. And this requires energy. Hence, iodide pump also acts as an ATPase system. So that if ATP is broken down, energy is released. That energy is utilized in the transportation of iodine, iodide, which gets into the follicular epithelial cell, there get it's trapped. And the second event of trapping of iodide is oxidation. Within the thyroid, the iodide that is taken up the follicular cells is oxidized to form the molecular form of iodine, which is the active form, and it is catalyzed by peroxidase in the presence of hydrogen peroxide, which supplies the oxygen. Thus, in the presence of hydrogen peroxide, the iodide peroxidase transforms the iodide into molecular or oxidized iodine molecule. And this is followed by first thyroglobulin is synthesized. Now we have come across with the presence of iodine inside the cell. So in the same cell, there is thyroglobulin with a number of tyrosines. In the same cell, we have oxidized or active form of iodine molecules. Okay, next, the activated iodine now searches for the tyrosine where it gets attached. And what happens? Mono and diiodothyronins are produced. And this process is called as iodination. The iodination of tyrosine in thyroglobulin takes place at 3 position, followed by the 5th position of the carbon of the aromatic nucleus, forming respectively monoiodothyronine, where it is added to the 3 carbon in the third position, and when both third and 5th positions are added, it is said to be a diiodothyronine. Two diiodothyroxine molecules undergo oxidative condensation to produce thyroxine by duly liberating alanine. During this reaction, what is happening? Alanine is liberated, and thus thyroxine is said to be formed. And triiodothyronine is produced by condensation of monoiodothyronine with diiodothyronine, and this process is called as coupling. So here what is happening? Monoiodothyronine and diiodothyronine undergo coupling to produce triiodothyronine. Two diiodothyronins undergo condensation to produce T4 or tetraiodothyronine, also called as thyroxine. And the final stage is said to be called as organification. Here, it involves the attachment of the iodine to the tyrosine residues. This is believed to occur on preformed thyroglobulin, which has been taken to the full stage of protein synthesis, but which has not been iodinated. In that case, what happens is we can see a thyroglobulin molecule where we come across with mono, di, tri, and tetraiodothyronine molecules as part of this organification process of thyroglobulin molecule. So coming to the schematic diagram, as this is said to be taken from the second edition of C.C. Chatterjee Human Physiology book, and here we see iodide through food. The salt which is rich in iodine goes into the blood and gets ionized to form iodide. And from there, gastrointestinal tract through the blood, it reaches the follicular epithelial cell. This is the cell. Once inside, it goes through the iodine pump and gets into as iodide only. After getting into the follicular epithelial cells in the form of iodide, in the presence of peroxidase and H2O2, which donates oxygen, it gets oxidized to form active form of iodine. This is followed by iodination of tyrosine residues, for which what is required? Thyroglobulin is required. So what happens in the thyroid follicular epithelial cells? Rough endoplasmic reticulum synthesizes thyroglobulin protein, and this protein in the Golgi complex is added with carbohydrate, and thus through the secretory granule vesicle, the thyroglobulin, which is a glycoprotein, is synthesized. And this glycoprotein is having a number of tyrosine residues to which iodine is added, a process called as iodination, resulting in mono and diiodothyronins or tyrosines. Mono and diiodothyronin undergo coupling to produce T3. Two diiodothyronins undergo condensation to produce T4 hormones. All these are part and parcel of thyroglobulin molecule. Now, these have to be secreted into the surrounding, what we call, into the blood. How this takes place? Let me explain this again once. So, after synthesis, what happens? Along with this, the thyroglobulin is said to be released into the center of each follicular epithelial cell, and it's stored as colloid. So this is the thyroglobulin molecule with all mono, di, tri, and tetraiodothyronins. Now this particular gland is stimulated now by thyroid stimulating hormone. And the thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates it. Now a process called as micropinocytosis occurs. Micropinocytosis. We know that thyroglobulin is a large molecular weight protein. Through the plasma membrane, it cannot enter the cell. It cannot enter the cell through the plasma membrane. So what has to happen? If this is the cell, this cell forms small pinocytic vesicles into which the thyroglobulin enters. So these pinocytic vesicles are called as micropinosomes. Micropinosomes. So these micropinosomes go inside, okay? They get separated from the plasma membrane, and these vesicles are now found to contain thyroglobulin. Now, because this is a cell, it contains all the cell organelles, and one such cell organelle is lysosome. So it combines with lysosome. So lysosome is a primary lysosome. When it combines with the pinosome or phagosome, it becomes a secondary lysosome. So now a secondary lysosome is said to be formed. So what is the secondary lysosome? The secondary lysosome contains all the different kinds of enzymes plus thyroglobulin molecule. So these enzymes are now involved in breaking down the thyroglobulin molecule so that mono, di, tri, and tetraiodothyronins are released. So because they are said to be simple amino acids, they come into the cell. From there, they are transported into the blood circulation. However, mono and diiodothyronins are not secreted because TSH influences the secretion of tri and tetraiodothyronins only. And here, mono and diiodothyronins are reutilized in the cell, whereas T3 and T4 are released into the normal circulation. Okay. Coming to the, after releasing into the normal circulation, they have to be transported through the blood. Thyroxine is transported with two plasma proteins. One is called as, both are said to be called as thyroxine binding proteins only. First one is a alpha globulin, thyroxine binding alpha globulin, which constitutes about 60%. And the second one is thyroxine binding prealbumin protein, TBG and TBPA. And TBPA constitutes 30%. Then what about the remaining 10%? The remaining 10% is free thyroxine. And that means thyroxine is not bound to any protein, is called as a free form. So thus, and coming to this, if let us say there are T4 molecules 50 and TBG and TBPA together they are said to be 40. That means there are still 10 T4 molecules which have to remain free. But in the free form only 10%. That means let's say only 5 molecules can be transported in free form. So there are remaining still 5 molecules. And these 5 molecules, that means when the binding capacity of these two proteins exceeds, that means the number of molecules of thyroxine are more than thyroxine can even bind with serum albumin. So thus thyroxine can be transported through the blood in 4 forms. One, thyroxine associated with TBG, the other thyroxine associated with TBPA, and the third is said to be thyroxine associated with the serum albumin, and the last one is free form. This is how it gets transported. Coming to the functions of the physiological functions or actions of these hormones. As I have said before, let me give you a comparative account of these two once again. Coming to the potency, T3 is more potent when compared with T4. T4 is said to be less potent when compared with T3. Okay, that means it is fast acting. Number two, half-life. When compared with T4, it lives for only short duration. Its half-life is very less, whereas T4 is long-lasting. In some cases, it remains there in the blood for even not just days, for weeks and months together, as seen in some subjects. That is the reason why in blood, T3 is very short-lived and T4 is long-lived. So whatever the actions that are performed in the body are said to be the long-lasting activities of the T4. Okay. And coming to the T3 and T4, what is their main function? These two are called as calorigenic hormones. The name implies that they're responsible for the production of energy. Energy is measured in calories. So we call this hormone as a calorigenic hormones because it accelerates energy production. How energy production takes place? By the breakdown of glucose. How the glucose is said to be broken down? By in the presence of oxygen, oxidation of glucose, oxidative phosphorylation we call it, which releases energy. So for which oxygen uptake is also required, and both of these are responsible for increasing the basal metabolic rate. Hence we call this hormone as a calorigenic hormone. The second important function is metabolism. So it regulates almost all metabolic activities of the body. Firstly, we start with carbohydrate metabolism. Thyroid hormones are responsible for stimulating the absorption of glucose from the intestine. Why? Because glucose is the source of energy. So whatever the intestine, glucose is present in the intestine, it has to be absorbed so that it can be transported through the blood and reaches the cell. So the first event in the production of energy is through transportation of glucose from intestine to blood and from blood to cells. This is accomplished by thyroid hormone. At the same time, if glucose is not taken at that time, that means we are not eating at that time, glucose is required. What happens now? In the liver and muscles, we store glycogen. So it mobilizes glycogen so that glycogen is broken down to release glucose, which can be utilized by the body for the production of energy. If liver sources are exhausted, glycogen sources, then what happens? It alternate pathways there for the production of glucose, gluconeogenesis. What is gluconeogenesis? It is the formation of glucose from non-carbohydrate sources, which we already have discussed while discussing pituitary gland. What are these non-carbohydrate sources? They are nothing but proteins from which glucose can be synthesized, a process called as gluconeogenesis. So in all these ways, what you see is their increased blood glucose concentration, resulting in hyperglycemia, and sugar tolerance is said to be reduced due to this. And coming to the second one, protein metabolism. Thyroid hormone is responsible for stimulation of RNA synthesis, that means transcription, followed by translation of mRNA producing proteins. So thus it is a protein anabolic hormone like pituitary hormone. Growth hormone is also anabolic and thyroxine is also anabolic. Coming to the lipid metabolism. This hormone increases synthesis of cholesterol and other lipids. At the same time, the breakdown of cholesterol and other lipids. Why the other lipids have to be broken down? Again, when the fatty acids are oxidized, it releases energy. So whatever the source of energy is there, the thyroxine is said to be utilizing it. And coming to the other functions, I'll start from the bottom. It is responsible for regulating the blood pressure. It is responsible for regulating the blood pressure. How do you know? There are two patients where thyroxine is less secreted. We call them as hyposecretion. When it is excessively secreted, we call it as hypersecretion. It results in hypothyroidism, while the other results in hyperthyroidism. In these hypothyroid patients, what the scientists found is these are said to be prone to cold. They cannot, what we call, uh, live in cold conditions. Why? Because here the temperature is said to be dropped. In this case, in these individuals, here they are said to be here high temperature, high body temperature is said to be produced because of the thyroxine activity. Thus, this is responsible for heat regulation. How the heat regulation takes place? By the production of energy only. How the energy is produced? By the breakdown of glucose in the presence of oxygen. How it takes place? Only when glucose is supplied and oxygen is supplied. Through which these are supplied? They are supplied through blood. So, in order to increase or to produce more amounts of energy, the blood flow also should increase. In order to increase the blood flow, what should increase? The heart rate should increase. So here the heart rate is increased, the blood flow is increased, because of which blood pressure is increased, and glucose and oxidation takes place, and large amounts of energy are produced. And during this entire, we know in physics, no uh, no work is said to be 100% efficient. When we perform a work, at least some part of the work is dissipated as heat. When we rub our hands, whatever the energy that is used in rubbing hands is used. For example, if it is 100 calories, only 90 calories are used for this rubbing, and the remaining 10 calories are emanated as heat. Thus, it is responsible for regulation of heat. In addition to these, it is responsible for increasing the content of fat content of milk in the mammary glands. This is what we have discussed when we were discussing about the hormonal control of reproduction in females. There I have said that prolactin is responsible for initial synthesis and secretion of milk. After that, the synthesis and secretion of milk is under the control of growth hormone and thyroxine. This is one thing. And the third thing is it is responsible for growth and differentiation of the entire body. It is responsible for skeletal growth. That means if this hormone is said to be not secreted in optimum quantities, your bone growth will not take place and that person will remain as a dwarf. Stunted growth is seen. Likewise, it is responsible for muscular growth, sexual growth, mental growth. Thus, when thyroxine is not secreted, that person's mental growth is stopped and it results in mental retardation. That person's sexual growth is stopped and it results in sterility. And that person's skeletal growth is stopped and he or she becomes a dwarf. That much impact is there with respect to thyroid gland. And coming to the final and fourth more important function that is called as growth and metamorphosis. Scientists found that thyroxine is also responsible for growth and metamorphosis. I would like to ask you one question here. Can anybody say what is the difference between neoteny and pedogenesis? Are you there? So did you hear these two terms, neoteny and pedogenesis? No. Very good. Excellent. So there is an example called as amblystoma. This is an amphibian. It has an axolotl larva. Okay. It is found in a pond. This larva is found in a pond. And in this pond, when this larva is said to be found, it is not considered by the scientists that are living there in that area. For example, let us say Mexico. In Mexican waters, this is present. And this is going to produce the children. That means, again, axolotls are said to be produced by this particular individual. So they consider this as adult. So some scientist came here and took this to another place where he wanted to do his experiment. And in that place, when he placed that in the water, after few hours or few days, maybe after few days, he could not see axolotl. What did he see? He could see amblystoma instead. So he got astonished. What happened to this axolotl? I have placed here axolotl, but that is not present here. So when he observed all the other things that are there in the pond, there are still some axolotls. In due course of time, they got metamorphosed to produce amblystoma. So based on this, they wanted to test the waters. So what is there in the water of Mexico and here? In the Mexican waters, they found that these are deficient of iodine and these are rich in iodine. By this experiment, they came to know that thyroxine, for thyroxine iodine is required. And without iodine, in the Mexican waters, that is an example. In the Mexican waters, this particular axolotl larva is not able to produce thyroxine. Hence, it is not metamorphosing. So how long it can stay for like this in this larval form? So soon after few days, it tried, few months, few years it tried. It's kept on growing. And now what is done? What is done? The main difference between a larva and adult is larva is sexually immature. Adult is sexually mature. And now this larva became sexually mature, a process called as pedogenesis. Thus, based on this pedogenesis, we come across with the fact that thyroxine is also required for growth and metamorphosis. Coming to the last and final topic of this, that is disorders associated with thyroid gland. So thyroid gland results in disorders called as thyroidism. The thyroidism is of two types, hypothyroidism and hyperthyroidism. Hypothyroidism occurs when this hormone is secreted in low quantities. Hyperthyroidism occurs when this hormone is secreted in high quantities, high secretion and low secretion. Okay, now in both the cases, what we see is we have seen already that this particular hormone is responsible for regulating the blood pressure. So when it is low in quantity, this individual suffers from low hypertension or low BP. And opposite to this, there is high hypertension, that is called as high blood pressure. This is another consequent feature. And another one is it regulates temperature. So these are susceptible to cold, whereas these are susceptible to high temperatures. So these are the basic things that are happening here. In another one is it is responsible for increasing the basal metabolic rate. Hence, in hypothyroid patients, they have a low BMR. The hyperthyroid patients have a high BMR. Basal metabolic rate is said to be high. Why? Because more energy is produced here, less energy is produced in hypothyroidism, in patients suffering from hypothyroidism. Now coming to what these are going to result in. When the thyroxine hormone is secreted in low quantities, it results in two kinds of diseases. One is said to be occurring in children, the other is said to be occurring in adults. In children, it results in cretinism, and in adults, it results in myxoedema. These are the two basic disorders associated with this. Whereas hyperthyroidism results in a disease called as Graves' disease. So let me explain these things one by one. So let me start with cretinism. The individuals suffering from cretinism are called as cretins. Cretins are almost having the same height as that of dwarfism seen when growth hormone is secreted in low quantities. That means both of these exhibit stunted growth in common. They are very short, maximum 3 feet, 3 feet to 3 inches like this. So both have in common, both are dwarfs. But here we call these as cretins, these as dwarfs. Dwarfism and this is cretinism. And the difference being, this is the common thing, and the difference being cretins are sexually retarded, dwarfs are they may be sexually retarded and may not be sexually retarded. And cretins are said to be mentally retarded and dwarfs are said to be having normal IQ. They are not said to be mentally retarded. So thus, because there is sexual retardation, these are sterile individuals. And in most of the cases in dwarfs, they are said to be, though in some cases there is sexual retardation, in most of the cases, they are found to be fertile. They can get married and they can produce children even. These are the difference between cretinism and dwarfism. And coming to the other one, that is myxoedema. So myxoedema is also called as Gull's disease because it is described by a scientist called as Gull. This is characterized by the accumulation of myxomatous tissue. It is characterized by the accumulation of myxomatous tissue. What is myxomatous tissue? Here, this is characterized by edematic swelling of the tissues with certain proteins like hyaluronic acid. And what happens is, when this thing happens, large quantities of water are released among the tissues, leading to edema. Edema means nothing but swelling due to accumulation of water. So large quantities of this uh, myxomatous tissue where there is edematic swelling of the tissues resulting in fluffy face and arms and thighs so that the entire body is said to be a somewhat swollen like thing. In that case, this disease is called as myxedema. Unlike the normal ones, these seem to be like obese person. The difference between obese person and myxoedemic person is obese person is having large amounts of fat, and here this person is had to be having myxomatous tissue where it is caused by the accumulation of fluid. And the third one is Graves' disease. Graves' disease is also called as another scientist discovered in another place. Hence hence it may be called as Basedow's disease. And this is also given another name that is called as exophthalmic goiter. But actually this is not goiter, only to referring it to a condition that is related to thyroid gland. When somebody asks you, what is the disorder associated with thyroid? You simply say that goiter. So, goiter is synonymous to thyroid gland. So, in order to show that this exophthalmic condition is caused by the disorder related to thyroid gland, this goiter is added here. But actually, exophthalmic condition is a pathological condition that can be seen in other disorders also. What is exophthalmic condition? Here, exo plus ophthalmos. What is exo? Means outside. Ophthalmos means eye. So what happens is when someone closes his eye, when someone closes his eye, what happens? The eyelids close it completely, isn't it? But in this person suffering from exophthalmic goiter, even when the individual tries to close the eye, he could not close it completely. Why? Because the eye bulges out. The eye bulges out. So as the eye bulges out, though he closes his eye, it is seems to be quite open. So this bulging out of the eye is called as exophthalmic condition that is characterized by hyperthyroidism. What happens with this? Whenever you get strong light rays on your eye, what you actually do? You just close your eyes. But though this person tries to close his eyes, he cannot close it. And the large amounts of rays fall on the retina and the eyes get damaged in this particular instance. In addition to the other symptoms that we have seen, when comparing hypo and hyperthyroidism, all are said to be present here. And coming to the last one, goiter. So goiter is a disease which is caused by the deficiency of the iodine. When iodine is deficient, the body cannot produce T4 and T3. When T4 and T3 are not produced, what happens? It results in goiter. So goiter is said to be characterized by all the features related to hypothyroidism. In addition to this, there is another feature by which we call it as goiter. What is that feature is? Here, this is the thyroid follicular epithelial cell. Okay, the function of the thyroid follicular epithelial cell is to synthesize and produce T3 and T4 hormones. And this is under the influence of thyroid stimulating hormone. Whenever the thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates it, it produces large quantities of T3 and T4 and releases them into the blood circulation. So then how this is regulated? The increased levels of thyroxine show a negative feedback effect on hypothalamus, so that releasing hormone is stopped, then thyroid stimulating hormone is stopped, and secretion of T3 and T4 is said to be stopped. Thus, their own concentration, the rise in concentration of these hormones is what is responsible for decreasing their concentration when it reaches the optimal level. Now, what happens is here this particular individual is said to be not having iodine in his blood. Why this is not he's not having iodine in his blood? Because the food that he is taking is said to be iodine deficient. So here thyroglobulin is produced, tyrosines are there, but iodine is absent. Then what happens? T3 and T4 levels are decreased. This is the normal level and they are now decreased. When they are decreased, there is a negative feedback mechanism. That means decrease increases. So there is a negative feedback mechanism where hypothalamus start producing what we call thyroid stimulating hormone releasing hormone, which stimulates anti-repeated release thyroid stimulating hormone that now stimulates thyroid follicles. So that thinking that by stimulating thyroid stimulating hormone, it starts synthesizing thyroxine and secretes them into the blood so that their concentration rises. But here what is happening? How much amount of thyroid stimulating hormone is secreted is not enough. Why? Because there is no iodine at all in the cells. So if there is no iodine at all, what happens? It cannot synthesize any kind of hormones. Then what happens? It keeps on producing the thyroid stimulating hormone. When it keeps on producing the thyroid stimulating hormone, this thyroid stimulating hormone shows an impact on the thyroid follicular epithelial cells. So this impact is of two types. One is called as hypertrophy, the other is called as hyperplasia. What is hypertrophy? Hypertrophy is increase in the size of the cell. Hyperplasia is increase in the number of cells. So I've said you before only when we are dealing with the size of these cells. In hyperthyroidism, they are large in size. In hypo, they are small in size. So why they what is happening here? As TSH is continuously stimulating this to produce T3 and T4, it does not know that there is no iodine. Now what is happening? There is hypertrophy and hyperplasia so that the number of cells, thyroid follicular epithelial cells increase and the size of the thyroid gland goes on increasing. Previously, on the either side of trachea, this is only this much in size. So when we touch the trachea, we cannot see it. But what happens? The size goes on increasing. And The neck, the neck bulges at this region so that we can see conspicuous thyroid lobes that can be seen from the outside. That is what is characterized, it is the characteristic feature of goiter. So these are the four disorders associated with thyroid gland. And with this, we come to the end of thyroid gland. So we have discussed about what is thyroid gland, where is it located, and the different types of hormones, their synthesis, secretion, and transportation, and the disorders associated with the thyroid gland. So any doubts, please ask me. Otherwise, we'll close. And tomorrow, I'll let you know after the church hours are over. I'll let you know the timings. Please keep in touch with the WhatsApp after 10 o'clock. Okay. Thank you.